The bright morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as passengers hurried to their gates. Among them was Miss Thompson, a distinguished civil rights attorney who had built her career fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. Today was supposed to be a routine first-class flight to New York for an important case meeting, but it would soon turn into something much more significant. Walking confidently through the terminal, her navy blue blazer perfectly pressed and her leather briefcase containing case files in hand, Miss Thompson made her way to the priority boarding line. She had done this hundreds of times before. Same airline, same route, same first-class ticket. The boarding process started normally enough, with the gate agent greeting her with a professional smile and scanning her ticket without issue. As she stepped onto the plane, the smell of fresh coffee and leather seats filled the air. The first-class cabin was already half full with business travelers typing away on their laptops or reading the morning news on their tablets. Miss Thompson found her seat, 3A, a window seat she had specifically chosen for the peaceful view of the clouds during her flight. That's when she noticed it, the flight attendant's expression changing ever so slightly as she watched Miss Thompson settle into her first-class seat. The attendant, whose name tag read Ms. Richards, kept glancing over while helping other passengers store their bags, her eyes repeatedly returning to seat 3A with what could only be described as suspicious interest. Most passengers would have missed these subtle looks, but after 15 years of handling discrimination cases, Miss Thompson had developed a keen eye for these behaviors. Still, she remained professional, organizing her documents for the upcoming meeting and settling in for what she hoped would be a productive flight. The first red flag came when Ms. Richards approached her, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a hint of skepticism that other passengers weren't receiving. "I need to verify your boarding pass again." Miss Thompson noticed that none of the other first-class passengers, not the gentleman in the expensive suit across the aisle, not the elderly couple in front of her, had been asked to show their documentation twice. She calmly reached for her boarding pass, which was neatly tucked into her passport holder. Other passengers were now starting to take notice of this unusual interaction. A young professional 2 rows behind had looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed as he observed the scene unfolding before him. "Here you go," Miss Thompson said politely, maintaining her composure as she handed over her documentation. The boarding pass clearly showed her seat assignment, first-class status, and priority boarding information. But instead of a quick glance and return, Ms. Richards scrutinized every detail of the ticket, holding it up to the light as if checking for a watermark. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew noticeably tense. A businessman across the aisle had stopped his phone conversation, now paying full attention to the situation. 2 flight attendants at the front of the cabin whispered to each other, throwing glances in their direction. What made the scene particularly striking was its stark contrast to the normal first-class boarding procedure. Other passengers had been greeted with warm smiles and offers of pre-flight beverages. Miss Thompson, however, was being treated as if her very presence in first class was suspicious, despite her impeccable credentials and professional demeanor. Little did Ms. Richards know that her actions in these next few moments would not only change the course of this flight, but would also spark a conversation about airline industry practices that would reach far beyond this morning journey from Atlanta to New York. The tension in the first-class cabin continued to build as Ms. Thompson stood up to place her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. It was a standard black rolling bag, the same kind countless travelers use every day, well within the airline's size requirements. She traveled with it dozens of times before without issue. Just as she lifted the bag, Ms. Richards rushed over from the front of the cabin, her heels clicking rapidly against the airplane's floor. "Ma'am," she called out, her voice sharp enough to make several passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "That bag looks oversized. You'll need to check it." The businessman in 4C glanced at his own carry-on, which was noticeably larger than Ms. Thompson's bag. He frowned, clearly picking up on the unfair treatment unfolding before him. A young woman in 2B had already pulled out her phone, pretending to text while actually recording the interaction. "I've flown with this bag many times," Miss Thompson replied calmly, her voice steady and professional. "It fits perfectly in the overhead bin, just like it has on my last dozen flights." She demonstrated by easily sliding the bag into the compartment, proving her point without confrontation. But Ms. Richards wasn't finished. She pulled out a measuring tape from her pocket, something no one had seen her do with any other passenger's luggage. "I'll need to measure it," she insisted, reaching for the bag. The overhead bins around them were already filled with larger bags that hadn't received this level of scrutiny. By now, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. A gentleman in a business suit paused his phone call, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. An elderly couple exchanged knowing looks, the wife shaking her head slightly at what she was witnessing. "Excuse me," called out a passenger from row 5, their voice clear and confident. "I couldn't help but notice that my bag is actually larger, yet you didn't measure it." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, some now openly recording the interaction on their phones. Ms. Richards' face flushed red, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "This is a matter of airline policy," she said, her voice getting louder. "If you can't comply, we'll have to remove you from the flight." The threat of removal hung heavy in the air. A flight attendant from economy class, who had been restocking supplies, stopped in her tracks, clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. She exchanged a concerned glance with another crew member. Miss Thompson stood her ground with remarkable composure, though anyone watching closely could see her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining her professional demeanor in the face of such treatment. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her airline status card, showing years of loyal customer history. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I'm a frequent flyer with over 100,000 miles this year alone. This bag has been on every one of those flights." She gestured to the overhead bin where her perfectly fitting bag sat. "Perhaps we could discuss why my luggage is being singled out for measurement when larger bags were allowed on without question." The other passengers had gone completely silent, the usual pre-flight chatter replaced by tense attention to the scene playing out before them. Some had their phones raised, others were taking notes, and a few were already typing emails to the airline's customer service. What happened in the next few moments would transform this routine flight into a powerful reminder about standing up to unfair treatment, and how the actions of ordinary people witnessing injustice can help bring about change. The situation reached a turning point when Miss Thompson calmly reached into her briefcase and pulled out her business card. "I believe it's important for you to understand who I am," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and I specialize in discrimination cases." At these words, Ms. Richards' face visibly paled. A passenger in row 2 suddenly sat up straighter, recognition dawning on his face. "Wait a minute," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Weren't you the attorney who won that big case against Capital Industries last month? The one that made national news?" The first-class cabin buzzed with whispered conversations. Several passengers pulled out their phones to look up the case being referenced. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold were now openly taking notes on their iPad. Ms. Richards glanced nervously at the growing number of phones recording the scene. The measuring tape in her hand trembled slightly as she realized the gravity of her actions. I'm just following procedure," she stammered, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. A gentleman in a gray suit stood up from his seat. "I've been flying first class on this route every week for the past 3 years," he announced. "I've never once seen anyone's bag measured after it was already in the overhead bin." He turned to address the other passengers. "Has anyone here ever seen this happen before?" The cabin fell silent as passengers looked at one another, then slowly shook their heads. A businesswoman near the front spoke up. "I fly this route twice a month. Never seen anything like this." Miss Thompson maintained her professional composure, though years of courtroom experience told her exactly how significant this moment was. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," she requested calmly, "and I'd appreciate it if these witnesses could share their contact information. Their observations might be valuable." Almost immediately, passengers began reaching for their business cards. A young professional who had been recording everything spoke up. "I've got the whole interaction on video, starting from when she first questioned your boarding pass. I'd be happy to email it to you." The flight attendant from economy class, who had been watching everything unfold, disappeared briefly into the cockpit. Everyone knew she was probably informing the captain about the situation. Ms. Richards stood frozen, her measuring tape now hanging limply at her side. The realization that dozens of passengers had witnessed and documented her behavior seemed to finally sink in. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety. "For the record," Miss Thompson said clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by the recording phones, "I'd like to point out that my bag is regulation size. I'm a platinum member with this airline, and I've been subjected to unusual scrutiny that I haven't witnessed being applied to any other passengers in this cabin." A man in the back of first class raised his hand. "I'm an airline employee off duty," he admitted. "What's happening here is completely against our company's policies. Every passenger should be treated with equal respect and dignity. I'll be submitting a report about this incident myself." The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Other flight attendants hovered uncertainly near the galley, whispering among themselves. Several more passengers had pulled out their phones to document the scene, while others were already typing emails to the airline's customer service department. Miss Thompson sat calmly in her seat, her legal pad out, taking detailed notes about everything that had transpired. Her years of experience told her that what happened next would be crucial, not just for this flight, but for addressing a larger pattern of behavior that needed to change. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted dramatically when a distinguished-looking gentleman in row 6 stood up. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "I think it's time I introduce myself," he announced, his voice carrying authority that commanded attention. "I'm a senior partner at Ms. Thompson's law firm." The revelation sent ripples through the cabin. Ms. Richards' face, already pale, now turned almost white. She took an involuntary step backward, nearly bumping into another passenger's seat. "I've been quietly observing this entire incident," the partner continued, pulling out his phone. "And I've documented every single interaction. Would you like to know what I've seen?" He didn't wait for a response before continuing. "I've watched my colleague, one of our firm's most respected attorneys, be subjected to treatment that no other passenger in this cabin has experienced." A flight attendant from economy class appeared with a tablet in hand, furiously taking notes. The partner turned to address her directly. "Let me be clear about what we've all witnessed. First, there was the unusual double-checking of boarding passes. Then, the suspicious glances. Now, this unprecedented measuring of a perfectly standard carry-on bag." Miss Thompson remained composed, though a slight smile crossed her face as she watched her colleague systematically break down the series of events. She'd seen him use this same methodical approach in countless courtrooms. "For the record," he continued, now addressing the whole cabin, "I'd like to note the time is 9:47 a.m., and we have approximately—" He glanced around the cabin quickly, at least 15 witnesses to these events, many of whom have video documentation. Other passengers began speaking up, offering their observations. A woman in designer glasses spoke clearly for the recording phones. "I board this flight every Tuesday. My bag is larger than hers, but nobody has ever measured it." A businessman added, "I've been sitting here watching everything." The different treatment was obvious from the moment she stepped on board. The partner pulled out his business card and handed it to the economy class flight attendant who was taking notes. "I suggest you pass this along to your corporate office. They'll want to know that they have a situation developing that could have serious implications for this airline." Ms. Richards had retreated to the galley, desperately trying to reach someone on the crew phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. Just then, the cabin fell silent as the chief flight attendant emerged from behind the curtain. She was older, with gray hair and the kind of confidence that comes from decades of experience. She took one look at the scene, the recording phones, the distressed Ms. Richards, the numerous passengers standing to share their accounts, and knew exactly what she was dealing with. "Ma'am," she addressed Miss Thompson directly, "I've been briefed about the situation. Would you be willing to step into the galley with me to discuss what's happened?" Before Miss Thompson could respond, the partner spoke up again. "As her colleague, I'll be accompanying her, and I suggest we keep the phones recording, if you don't mind. It's important to have a clear record of everything that transpires." The other passengers watched intently as this scene unfolded. Some were still recording, others were already posting about the incident on social media, and a few were drafting emails to the airline's corporate office. What had started as a routine morning flight had transformed into a powerful moment that would soon catch the attention of people far beyond this aircraft. The chief flight attendant, with over 20 years of experience handling difficult situations, led Ms. Thompson and her colleague to the front galley. Her face showed genuine concern as she listened to their account of what had transpired. The other passengers watched intently through the gaps between seats, phones still recording, ensuring transparency in this crucial conversation. First and foremost, the chief attendant began, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "I want to apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not what our airline stands for." She glanced at the growing number of social media posts appearing on passengers' phones, knowing this situation needed immediate attention. Back in the cabin, passengers were sharing their own experiences. A business traveler spoke up. "You know, I've seen subtle discrimination like this before, but I've never spoken up. Today changed that for me." Others nodded in agreement, some typing out their witness statements on their phones or laptops. The young professional who had recorded everything from the beginning raised his hand to get the chief attendant's attention. "Ma'am, I have clear footage of the entire incident, including the initial boarding pass check and the bag measurement attempt. Would you like me to send this to the airline's customer service department?" Miss Thompson maintained her professional demeanor as she addressed the chief attendant. "What concerns me most," she explained, "isn't just my experience today. It's knowing that others might face similar treatment without having a cabin full of witnesses or the professional background to address it." The chief attendant nodded solemnly, taking detailed notes on her tablet. "I'm documenting everything," she assured them. "But more importantly, I want you to know what actions we're taking right now." She turned her tablet to show them a formal incident report she was filing in real time. Meanwhile, the off-duty airline employee who had spoken up earlier approached with his own documentation. "I've already contacted our regional manager," he informed them. "They're taking this very seriously. In fact, they've requested to speak with you directly once we land." Ms. Richards stood at the far end of the galley, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible worry as she watched her supervisors handle the situation. The other flight attendants had quietly distanced themselves from her, focusing instead on preparing the cabin for departure. A gentle tap on Ms. Thompson's shoulder caught her attention. The elderly couple from row 2 had come forward. "We travel frequently," the wife said softly, "and we've seen things like this happen before. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." The chief attendant made a decision. "Ms. Richards will be removed from this flight," she announced firmly. "We'll have another crew member take her place." She turned to Ms. Thompson and her colleague. "I'd assure you, this will be thoroughly investigated at the corporate level." The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. What had started as tension and discomfort was transforming into something more powerful. A moment of unity among strangers who had witnessed injustice and chosen to stand against it. As the replacement flight attendant arrived, the chief attendant made a cabin-wide announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience. More importantly, I want to thank you all for speaking up when you saw something wrong. This is how we make air travel better for everyone." The passengers, many of whom had been strangers just an hour ago, now shared knowing looks and supportive nods. They had become more than just witnesses. They were part of a moment that would spark important changes in airline policies and training procedures. The next 30 minutes brought a flurry of activity both on and off the aircraft. The airline's corporate office had been alerted, and their response was swift and decisive. A video call was arranged in the cockpit with senior management before the flight's departure, showing just how seriously they were taking the situation. The replacement flight attendant, a friendly woman with a warm smile, made her way through the first-class cabin, offering complimentary premium drinks to all passengers. "We appreciate your patience and involvement in making this right," she said sincerely to each person. The off-duty airline employee, who had been instrumental in escalating the situation, shared some insight with nearby passengers. "In my 15 years with the company, I've never seen such a quick response from corporate," he mentioned, checking his phone. "They're already drafting a public statement." Meanwhile, Miss Thompson sat quietly in her seat, reviewing the handwritten statements that several passengers had given her. The elderly couple had written a particularly detailed account, even noting the exact times of each interaction. The young professional who had recorded everything was helping her create a secure online folder where all the video evidence could be stored. The chief flight attendant returned from the cockpit with news. "The regional director would like to meet you personally when we land in New York," she informed Ms. Thompson. "They're also arranging for a customer service team to be at the gate to gather statements from any passengers willing to share their observations." A businesswoman who had been quietly observing everything spoke up. "I serve on a corporate board that deals with diversity and inclusion," she said. "Would it be helpful if I shared our training materials with the airline? We've developed some effective programs that might be valuable." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as an unfortunate display of discrimination had evolved into a powerful example of people coming together to create positive change. Passengers who had been strangers an hour ago were now exchanging contact information, promising to follow up on the incident's outcome. The partner from Ms. Thompson's law firm was busy on his laptop, drafting a detailed summary of events. "This isn't just about one incident," he explained to those nearby. "This is an opportunity to create lasting change in how airlines train their staff and handle similar situations in the future." As the flight prepared for departure, the chief attendant made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that your actions today have already led to some immediate changes. The airline's training department has requested all documentation from this incident to use as a case study for future employee training." The replacement flight attendant approached Ms. Thompson with a letter. "This is a personal apology from our regional director," she explained softly. "They want you to know that they're not just sorry this happened. They're committed to making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Passengers throughout the cabin were now sharing their own experiences and discussing ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. A teacher mentioned incorporating this story into her lessons about standing up for what's right. A business executive talked about reviewing his own company's training procedures. The plane finally began pushing back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, but not a single passenger complained about the delay. They understood that they had been part of something important, a moment when ordinary people chose to stand together against unfair treatment and helped create real change. The story didn't end with that flight to New York. Within hours of landing, videos of the incident had spread across social media platforms. The airline's swift response caught many by surprise. Instead of trying to downplay the situation, they faced it head-on. By early afternoon, the airline's CEO had released a video statement. "What happened this morning on Flight 2376 does not reflect our values," he declared. "We're not just apologizing. We're taking immediate action to ensure this never happens again." The videos posted by passengers told the story clearly. a professional woman being unfairly targeted, fellow travelers standing up for what's right, and a company choosing to learn from its mistakes rather than hide from them. Each share and comment added to the growing conversation about treating everyone with dignity and respect. Back at the airline's headquarters, things were moving quickly. The training department had already begun revising their materials, incorporating real footage from the incident, with permission, to show employees exactly what not to do. The off-duty airline employee who had spoken up was invited to join a newly formed committee on passenger relations. Ms. Thompson's law firm received countless calls from other travelers sharing similar experiences. Rather than pursuing legal action, she saw an opportunity for positive change. "Let's work together to fix this," she suggested in a meeting with airline executives. "This isn't about punishment. It's about progress." The elderly couple who had witnessed everything wrote a letter to their local newspaper, which was widely shared online. "We've been flying for 50 years, and today we saw something remarkable. Not just the problem, but how people came together to solve it." The young professional's video documentation became part of a new training program, not just for this airline, but for several others who recognized they needed to do better. Flight attendants around the country started having important conversations about unconscious bias and how to serve all passengers fairly. A month later, the airline invited Ms. Thompson to speak at their annual staff training conference. The room fell silent as she shared her experience, but her message wasn't about blame. It was about growth. "Every difficult moment is a chance to learn and improve," she told them. "What matters isn't that the incident happened, but how everyone chose to respond to it." The business travelers who had witnessed the incident stayed connected through a professional networking group, occasionally sharing updates about positive changes they'd seen in air travel. The teacher who had been on board created a lesson plan about standing up for others, which was adopted by schools across the country. Perhaps most importantly, other passengers became more aware and ready to speak up. Flight attendants reported that travelers seemed more considerate of each other, more willing to help when they saw someone being treated unfairly. The incident had created a ripple effect of kindness and awareness. The airline made good on its promises. They revised their training programs, created a passenger advocacy board, and implemented new procedures for handling complaints. Ms. Richards, the former flight attendant, was required to complete extensive retraining before being considered for reinstatement. 6 months after the incident, a follow-up story appeared in several major news outlets. It wasn't just about what had gone wrong that day. It was about how one incident, handled properly, could create lasting positive change. The airline's new training program had become a model for others in the industry. The story became more than just a viral moment or a corporate scandal. It turned into a case study of how people working together could turn a negative situation into an opportunity for growth and improvement. It showed that sometimes the most powerful changes start with ordinary people simply choosing to do what's right.